There's an ongoing debate that we have within the disability community, and there's a range of opinions on it. And that's to say, disability as inspiration porn. Your story, this story is so inspiring. The most important thing is not that people are inspired, but they're inspired to take action. It doesn't matter quite so much to me what the action is, as long as people do start to take action.
Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast. I'm your host, Jen Wilson. This is a podcast where we discuss people, planet, and profit. In each episode, we'll learn from world-leading experts who can help us see the future we want and our role in it. This is episode 29, Uniquely Embodied. Dillon Hargrave is a seasoned entrepreneur with a diverse background. Over the course of the past 25 years, he's honed his creativity, entrepreneurial prowess, and resilience. All of this has been enriched by the unique perspective of living with the daily realities of right hemiparesis, resulting from a pre-birth stroke-like experience. He's refined his expertise in leadership and community development through radical vulnerability and the emphasis on personal ecology. I am absolutely delighted to speak with you today, Dillon. Welcome to the Future in Sound podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here.
I was wondering, Dillon, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So my name is Dillon Hargrave, and I am from Tulsa, Oklahoma. My occupation is that I consider myself kind of a coach and a consultant, and I work with an organization that I created called Sauntermore. And Sauntermore, as an organization, specifically targets leaders living with disabilities, and we journey with them on their path of full potential. And what I do primarily as the founder of Sauntermore is I work with different leaders across industries who are really interested in exploring how to best lead, considering that they have what I describe as unique embodiments, which is to say a disability that was either caused at or after birth, really, or even before in my case.
So interesting, because this audience is used to hearing from business leaders who are either investors looking at investing in businesses or executives of businesses. And we're used to talking about the topic of diversity and inclusion. I think you have a really unique perspective on this, and I'd love to hear how you think about terms like diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you asked that, particularly right now. And I recognize that you are in London, and I'm sure you have a very global audience. And, I'm speaking to you from the middle of the United States, Tulsa, Oklahoma. And, to not get too political, where DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion are words that are very much hot button topics, and many people would say are under attack. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what do we mean? What really do we mean when we say diversity, equity, or inclusion, right? And for me, when I think of all these things, I honestly put a very personal lens to it, because not only am I a person who is living with a disability, I have other people living with different types of disabilities in my immediate family. I am also a multicultural person, and I have a multicultural family. So whenever I fill out like the census here in the United States, I'm occasionally offered the opportunity to explain more how I would describe all of this makeup. And I say contemporary North American, right? And my point is to say is that I get my value from what I see as my own ability to include all of my diverse parts in my identity as a leader. And I believe that when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion at an organizational level, we need to be thinking about how we can integrate all of the diverse parts from our stakeholders and our communities that we serve as a way to make longer lasting, more impactful business models.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'd actually really love to get into stakeholders in just a moment. And before we do, I'd love to hear, when you're talking to business leaders about inclusion, what are some of the key messages that you share?
Yeah, when I talk to business leaders about inclusion, some of the key messages I share, I think to try to kind of think about maybe some of the more technical things we've seen recently, I would say that one of the bigger things that I've been watching, and I think a lot of people those of us who work within the disability space have been watching, has been the increase of the use of technology, like Zoom meetings in professional spaces. And we've actually seen an increase of people with disabilities being employed for the first time in a very, very long time, in my lifetime, at least. And that's something that is really interesting. I think that more importantly, when I get the opportunity to really have a heart to heart or talk to leaders about these things, is I think one of the really unique things that I've learned in my experience has been that, and I will admit that I'm coming from a background where I identified as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, way before I identified as somebody who lived with a disability. And as a part of that, I really bought into this hustler mindset, this not enough, never enough idea of how to lead a business, how to lead myself. And what I've learned by working with people with disabilities is to say that things will take longer if we're being intentional about including people living with disabilities in terms of how we work through the process of our business. But what I have been really pleasantly surprised by when I've gone through these processes is that by slowing down those processes, it allows for more authentic work to be created, which actually create allows for more authentic outcomes, as opposed to just trying to rush through something as a way to say that we, are feeding what I would call our addiction to productivity, just to get things done, just to check off the box or to fill up our calendar. And so that's something that I like to bring up as a way to really allow people to start thinking about what is the opportunity in the long term by being more inclusive of people living with disabilities in leadership positions, specifically in the workplace.
Dylan, what's an example of slowing down and getting more authentic outcomes?
The best example I can give from my direct experience has been in a recent chapter of my career, specifically as a virtual assistant and executive coach of a disability ministry here in the United States. And that ministry is a nonprofit. And whenever I started working with them, had a fiscal sponsor. And as one of the first projects that I helped them get through, we wanted to get them to become their own standalone 501(c)(3), which requires a tremendous amount of paperwork and bureaucracy.
For
And one of
international, sorry, Dylan, for international listeners, what's a
yes.
501?
Okay, yeah, thank you for allowing me to clarify. They wanted to become their own standalone nonprofit, which
Right.
is to say they wanted to get their own tax designation here in the United States that allowed them to become their own entity, and then they would no longer have to be sponsored by another organization that allows them to operate basically under their fiscal authority.
Got
And
it.
I'm not a lawyer, don't quote me on some of those things, but that's the basic idea. Does that help?
They wanted to become a nonprofit on their own.
Yeah, thank
Got it.
you. I appreciate it. So the point is to say is that, I had started a couple businesses. I had been involved in some nonprofits. I never actually started or helped anybody do this process. So I think that one of the things I was really surprised by was that it took a lot longer, but it made sense that it took longer to me once we actually got through the process, is because it required the me and the founder who has cerebral palsy, and I work with him mostly to help him do his email and correspondence, but we had to read through as a team all of these documents as opposed to just having one person designated to accomplishing these goals, which allowed us to be a lot more confident whenever we were able to get through the process that we had done it correctly and that nothing was missed, that our T's were crossed and our I's were dotted. And I think that that is what I would call a more authentic outcome for that process, as opposed to saying, we're going to give it to this one person and they're going to do it and we're going to trust that they do it. And we want them to get it done as quickly as possible because ultimately, we've set this goal. And I would say that, to be fair, there is an argument for the planning fallacy in my timeline that I set with it. But I think that for the sake of giving an example that most organizations, I think, would have wanted that task to be accomplished in a much faster timeline than it was. But I think that there was a richness through the process that allowed for us to be able to have a lot more. Let me say that the founder in particular expressed a great deal of relief when it was accomplished, and a great sense of accomplishment for having done it with the team, even though it took twice as long as we thought it would originally. Does that make sense?
It really does. And, I'm just thinking about real life examples in my world. So having dealt with legal contracts, and, sometimes you have sort of internal controls or checks and balances on contracts. However, it can take much longer if you don't get the right input at the right time. So you run forward with a contract that you think looks good and it goes a couple of steps. And then somebody who should have been involved at the beginning says, hold on a second, we need to start from scratch. And you incur additional legal fees. And so, I do think that there's something about collaboration here that's sort of interesting. And there are parallels even outside of, diverse abilities like we're talking about today.
For sure. I totally agree with you. And I think something that kind of maybe a bigger bucket or chunking up a little bit, I've even had this conversation even with my mom, is to say that as somebody who's lived with this disability, we're a lot more open to asking for help and being real intentional about what we're asking for and how we ask.
Mhm.
And when we allow ourselves to receive that help, that is ultimately going to bring new information to the table that allows us to, take another look at whatever decision we're making. And that inevitably is going to take more time, but we should have better outcomes.
It's really interesting. We were talking on the podcast, Eric Collins, who started a fund here in the UK called Impact X, and they invest in underrepresented founders. And the way he described it was that if you have to have a lot of resilience through life, it's almost like when you exercise. And I know you're a big exerciser. You go through strain and that builds muscle and strength for the next step that you take. And so he's actually had some global and European leading investments in terms of return by targeting, say, Black twins who are overlooked by other investors. And he invested in them and now they're, unicorns kind of thing. And I wonder, just as you describe, being more, open, being more open to asking for help, et cetera, if that resilience element also comes in to the conversation from your perspective.
Yeah, without a doubt, and I mean, I could probably spend the next 40 minutes just talking about that alone because I'm very passionate about it. And that's just a way to allow I'm saying that out loud as a way to say, let's keep it tight and keep it pointed. But will say, I'll start by saying I do remember hearing that on the podcast. And I was really happy to hear that. And that was one of the reasons why I was eager to have this conversation with you, because I knew kind of where the podcast conversation was coming from. And I really do agree with that. And I think that my initial takeaway is actually coming from a little bit of a different orientation, because one of my other contracts is as a casting director for an investment firm here in the United States. And in that role, I talk to business owners from all over the country, from all different industries, all different stages of business. And I do that, talk to 25 to 30 people a week. And I will say that there is certainly in my experience, and I don't have a direct tally, so don't ask for the details, but my experience is to say that there is a much higher representation of people who identify as living with a disability in the entrepreneurial community than there is in the established economy, I would say. And that's to say that I talk to so many people who say, I went through so many challenges that created such a resilience in me that starting a business seemed like something that I could accomplish. And or they take that part of their story and say, that's why I was successful in creating this firm and creating this product or service or growing it to this degree, right? So I would say that it's been my experience, and I would say as an entrepreneur who lives with a disability myself, I've learned how to have a tremendous amount of resilience that I have carried over into all of my roles, whether in my own businesses or working for other businesses, that have allowed me to thrive. And I will say that one of the reasons why I have leaned so heavily into entrepreneurship is that there have been organizations and bureaucracies and elements of existing businesses that I've run up against that I can define as brittle, maybe, and not resilient, that have been painful to me to a degree to where I don't want to be in those organizations anymore. Because I think that resilience and ability to come back and to even adjust and make to really more effectively consider what I would say the human element is critical. And I think that as humans, we all have to be resilient. Some of us is just required to do so more throughout their lives than others through specific circumstances and conditions.
Hey, it's Jen. I just wanted to take a quick moment to let you know a bit about Rico and what we do. We're a tech-enabled advisory firm that helps private market investors and companies measure sustainability metrics using our software platform. We also help you to set targets and focus your efforts on sustainability areas that really matter for your business. And finally, we help clients to translate all of this work into your core value creation strategy or your business model. Check us out at re.co.com to get in touch. All right, now back to our conversation. So what does excellence look like? Say if you're looking at a medium-sized business and they are absolutely nailing inclusion from your perspective, what are some of the things that you see in a business that's truly excellent in this regard?
Yeah, it's a great question. I really appreciate that at this point in time in the conversation because it does allow me to paint a picture for people about what it does look like to get it right. And I think that's a great opportunity and a blessing for me to do that. And so what I think what excellent looks like is not only as an organization, as a medium size organization, do you create an authentic environment of welcome for people living with disabilities, which is to say is that they feel like they belong at the organization, which is very complicated. And I will say that it's best to be intentional and take your time on and ask for feedback about how you are successful in achieving that. But that's just the foundational element. I think that more importantly, people that need to feel like they belong and they need to feel like they can contribute to that organization in a meaningful way to the degree, and this is where the excellence piece comes in, to the degree to which there are clear pipelines for advancements into leadership for those people with disabilities, that they aren't just being pigeonholed in a specific role or a specific responsibility, that they are seeing that they have the opportunities to create growth for them professionally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. When we talk about sustainability and responsible investment in some of these concepts more broadly, ESG, which I know has also been politicized in the United States as a term, but still, the social and governance pieces. We think a lot about how do we embed that into the core of the business, into core strategy, rather than it sort of being a peripheral or siloed approach. So, we would never bring a regular employee into a business and not think about their progression. People are always moving and growing. And so it strikes me as odd that you would bring a cohort in and not think about growth. So it's a really important point that you've just brought up, Dillon.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I would say kind of in a parallel, and this maybe goes a little bit back to, the brittle nature of certain business models and policies and structures that I've seen, is to say that if somebody has a medical emergency and needs to take some time off, as an example, and maybe they take off 1 or 2 more days than they were allowed, right? And then I'm taking this from a direct example from my network, is to say, then they are more or less forced to resign because they no longer feel like they're welcome in the organization. That organization then has to pay to replace them. And I think that far too often, and I've been working a lot more within the workforce space, people forget how expensive it is to replace those people. And I think that's what we forget about these policies that say you have to show up in this seat for 8 hours a day for 40 hours a week, or else you lose your job. Well, then it's going to cost you another $30,000 or however much money to fill that again. And was it really worth it to have that policy in place for you to then have to go back and look for somebody else? And that's a question that's changing constantly for every organization over time in every industry. But I think that it's important that we start to think about these things in a more holistic fashion.
As you turn your mind to the next 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see in terms of, trends and practices surrounding uniquely embodied individuals in business?
I think similarly to the goals of people in other marginalized communities, I would like to see more direct representation and leadership. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, it is possible for us to have roughly, this is the quoted number in large, of 25% of the population lives with some sort of disability. We should have 25% of people in roles of leadership in our medium to large organizations specifically who are living with this disability. And I think that that would be both an impressive and yet an achievable outcome in that time frame.
One of the things that we're seeing increased conversation around here in the UK, and I'm sure it's global, is some of the diverse cognitive, some call it disabilities, but say, ADHD or dyslexia or, different. So when you're speaking about, differences, like what's encompassed in that?
Yeah, it's a question that always comes up, and I will say I refer to those people as my neurospicy friends. I have a lot of them. May not be a little bit neurospicy myself. And I will say that, ultimately, I mean, I will say I spent years asking myself that question whenever I was kind of hit with it in my face about how do I identify as somebody living with disability? How have I integrated that in my own identity? What does that mean for me when I look at, my community outside people I spend time with? I would say that it's ultimately, I like to think of disability and my organization is built with this as a foundational value, is defining disability in the most encompassing way possible, which is just to say is if you can define your experience in a way that says whether it's through my physical embodiment or through my cognitive makeup, however I perceive my moving through the world or through my professional life is affected by this specific outcome that I've identified that's resulted to either how I perceive that I'm moving through the world or how I physically move through the world, then that should be something that should be considered. And that should be something that should be explored and you should be supported in, and accommodation for that, right? Even if it means you should be able to bring your crochet kit to your desk, right? For some of my neurospicy friends who have stimming things, right? That should be considered. So I think ultimately, as a way to not get overly verbose, because I think that starts to get away from the point, is to say defining it in a way that's most encompassing possible and allows whoever the person is who's with the lived experience is allowed to express that in a way that's meaningful to them and allows them to be more integrated in their personal and professional lives or live to their fullest potential, as I say.
Live to your fullest potential and just honor, what people are experiencing for themselves. I think that makes a lot of sense. And Dillon, I wanted to come back to your point about stakeholders earlier. So one of the things that we're seeing here in the EU, quite an advanced policy called, the CSRD here in Europe, where companies are being asked to report on quote unquote material ESG factors, meaning elements of sustainability, social governance, et cetera, areas that are not only material to the company itself financially, but also material to stakeholders. And I'm just wondering if you can walk us through, when you think about stakeholder engagement and how to identify stakeholders from a business perspective, what are some of the elements that you think through?
When I think of stakeholders, I think of anybody who has a vested interest in the outcome of the organization's activities, right? When I say vested interest in the outcome, I think specifically, I mean, you think of, we'll get academic for a second, right? So the most direct stakeholders are either the employees or management or ownership of the organization and the customers, right? Those are some of the big bucket stakeholders. Also, what I think that people should be more aware of, and I think that we're bad about this in general, is what are the activities of that business affecting in that community where that business is affecting? Where are you doing business and who are the auxiliary networks that are being affected by that? And I think that if you can maybe more broadly define stakeholders in similar way to more broadly defining living with disabilities, then that allows for better narratives around what I understand is you're defining as material benefit.
It's just interesting because that is an area that basically everybody's thinking through how to define it, right? Like, how do we define our stakeholders? And I just, I had the sense that you would have a nuanced approach to that. So,
Well, and I mean, I can be a little bit more specific too, because I feel like I'm being a little bit high level, and I like to be more specific when I can. I think of just the show that we filmed. I'm a casting director for. We film it here in the city where I live, although it's produced by an investment firm that's not from the state. But we film it in a place, and we have contractors who work for the organization, both coming from outside of the city and from within the city. And then inevitably, the money that goes into that production gets dispersed throughout those various locations, right? So when you start to be particular about stakeholders, even for that one production, that one business, or that one product or service of a business model, then starts to become very expansive, right? So I mean, I think that I would say maybe as a way to hedge myself a little bit, I would say just to be intentional about where maybe kind of how you weight the impact, maybe. Because I think that, that should be considered as well. You don't just want to say everybody, that every action, every dollar touches should be considered the same. I understand the complex nature of it, and it's certainly something that we should probably be talking a lot more about.
and if listeners were to do one thing differently tomorrow after listening to this conversation, what action do you think they should take?
This question leads me kind of into an ongoing debate that we have within the disability community. And there's a range of opinions on it. And that's to say, disability as what they define, or what some people define as inspiration porn. Your story, this story is so inspiring. Okay, right? And some people take great offense to it, and some people don't, right? And some people are happy about those things. I think what I have understood in my experience in my journey to this point is to say that the most important thing is not that people are inspired, but they're inspired to take action. And to that point, I think that it's so rare that people are inspired to take action in a way to meaningfully engage within their own personal or professional relationships in a way that is more accessible and is more welcoming of people with disabilities. That it doesn't really matter to me, and I think a lot of us in the space, what that action is. It's just that do they take intentional action? Is that they hear the story and then they do move to act. They do move to think about, okay, well, and I'll just speak, I've stayed away from it intentionally to this point, but in the United States, we have the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it could be as simple as saying, are we really up to code? Does our door really open when we push the button, right? How do we deal with that from our facilities management perspective? It could be that simple, right? Or it could be even more complex to say, how do I actively recruit and engage and train people living with autism, for example? Let's get specific. But it doesn't matter quite so much to me what the action is, as long as people do start to take action.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And one of my favorite questions to ask on this podcast is my final question for you, Dillon, and that's, if you had to name one book that particularly shaped your perspective, what book would that be?
It's a good question, and I'm glad I was able to think about this a little bit beforehand. But the answer came to me immediately, because it's very specific and it jumps out at me because I actually currently work for the author as a consultant. It is the founder of the disability ministry out of Dallas, wrote a book that tremendously impacted my journey called The Julian Way, which is also the name of the organization. The subtitle of the book is A Theology of Fullness for All of God's People. And that really impacted me as a way to understand really the work that has been done historically around disability, social justice, specifically within the religious communities, as well as really what is going on today and in the next 5 to 10 years in that movement and the opportunities that exist. And so that's the book and I bought it. I think I bought them out on Amazon, at least at one point in time. And I've given that book away to so many people because I think it's foundational to begin conversations around anti-ableism, to understand the models of disability and how they impact people, and the work that has been done historically, which there's, I would say, tragically little of. But, as a way to for those of us who like to have an intellectual model for things to move forward.
Dillon, thank you so much for joining us on the Future in Sound podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
The Future in Sound podcast is written and hosted by Jen Wilson and produced by Chris Attaway. This podcast is brought to you by Rico, a tech-powered advisory company helping private market investors pursue sustainability objectives and value creation in tandem. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell a friend about it. And if you have a moment to rate us in your podcast app, we'd really appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for listening.